Study design is increasingly empowered by a rich and diverse array of data, and new sources continue to emerge, fueled by advances in AI that enable the integration of information from literature, clinicaltrials.gov, digitized protocols, and more. And harnessing these complementary data streams allows researchers to design studies that are not only operationally efficient, but also more inclusive, informed, and scientifically sound. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Miles Skoda, and this is the clinicalleader.com virtual event series. And today we're talking embedding AI in critical IRB operations data to drive intelligent study design. So joining me for this presentation are two industry experts, and I'm going to bring them up right now. First, from IDC, we have Dr. Namita Lemay, Research Vice President for Life Sciences R&D Strategy and Technology, and from Advarra, Managing Director of AI and Data Science Analytics, Ian Bailey, who together are going to look at how the industry can critically evaluate and integrate these data streams into their study design, a design decision, and cover critical use cases, analytical models, and AI techniques that can transform these inputs into meaningful insights to optimize study design and maximize operational potential. So we are going to be holding a Q&A session following this presentation as well. Feel free to submit questions as we go along. We'll get to as many as possible during that Q&A. And any that we don't get to, I'll pass along to the team for potential follow-up after the event. And then just a bit of housekeeping. If you run into any issues today, please try refreshing your browser first. If your problem persists, you can submit a question through the Q&A, and I'll help get you back on track. And then finally, this event will be available on demand, usually within a day, often much less. You get a link to it via email, or you can just use the same link that you used today. So with that said, let me turn it over to Ian to get us started. Ian?
Perfect. Thanks, Miles. And thank you everyone so much for joining us today. Namita and I are extremely excited to be having the conversation. And we've got lots of topics that we're planning on covering today, ranging from IRB operations data to how AI is being used in study design today, who's involved in the process of designing a protocol, what are some of the friction points and the challenges that we're seeing too. So it should be a nice, fruitful conversation for both of us here, but we're really excited for everyone for joining. As Miles mentioned, we do have Q&A at the end. So as you guys are thinking about some questions, feel free to pop them into the chat. We will do our best to accommodate a couple of them towards the tail end with the time that we do have. But thank you again, everybody, for joining us today. You'll see here on the screen, we do have a question for the audience. And there's so many of you that are joining today from really all walks of life when it comes to supporting the clinical trial process and the execution of a trial. But we want to hear from you. What are you most hoping to get out of the webinar today? A couple different options there on the screen for you in terms of responses. And we'll give you guys maybe about 30 seconds or so to provide some responses back. And then we'll pull the results on screen here to see where's everybody's heads are at, so we can take a look at what folks are thinking about and also who's all here today. So again, thank you all so much for joining. We're really excited about the topic and the conversation today. Okay, so let's go to the results so far. Let's take a peek. All right. So scroll through here, 50% real world examples of applying AI to study design challenges. Well, Namita, I think we've got our work cut out for us in terms of what we've got covering today, but I think the good news is we've got some ideas, some examples as well for where we're seeing that in practicality. So fantastic. And then a close second, but not so close, guidance on integrating AI into existing study design workflow. So hopefully we'll cover a handful of these topics here today. But again, if you guys do have questions or aren't hearing something, feel free to throw it into the chat. We'll try to get to it towards the end of the discussion today. So with that, let's transition into our first topic and our first question. So Namita, what I've kind of noticed is that over the last 5 or so years, if not even further, average number of protocol endpoints have been increasing pretty dramatically, materially. Eligibility criteria has gone up. Required assessments has increased pretty dramatically as well, especially in kind of very specific therapeutic areas like oncology, neuroscience, for example, too. But from your perspective, why is clinical trial design more complex today than it was just 5 years ago?
Great question, Ian. And I think you're pretty much on point that there are pretty complex therapeutic areas, new changes that are happening in clinical trials. According to me, the clinical trials of today are really like shifting sands. things are continuously changing, right? You're talking about new technologies, new study designs, you're talking about new data sources, new endpoints. It's like a like shifting sands, right? And with all of that comes increased complexity. The other thing is there's a kind of heightened focus on precision medicine. So you spoke about oncology, neuroscience, rare diseases. If you look at approximately out of 46 approvals by the FDA in 25, around 56%, I believe, were related to rare diseases, and 35% were related to oncology. That says a lot, right? And when you're talking about these complex indications, you're talking about biomarkers, you're talking about patient stratification, subpopulation analysis. There's a lot of things that you need to look at. So you're also talking about newer, more complex trial designs. You're talking about master protocols. And whether it is basket or umbrella or platform trials, everyone's trying to find out ways of making trials faster, more efficient, and kind of accelerating the process. But when you talk about these study designs, there are other aspects that come into it, right? So you have to look at interim assessments. You have to look at early terminations. You have to look at sample size re-estimation. You look at, say, hey, do you need to tweak your schedule of assessments? More complex dosing regimens. You're also looking at things like radioligand therapy coming into the picture and theranostic pairs. So it's very complex. Statistical, operational complexity is increasing. Demanding higher and more improved governance. And so, as we try to kind of weave through this, have we really become more efficient with all this increase in complexity? Look at the costs. I would say there are 4 things that we should think of: costs, delays, study delays, protocol amendments, and finally data. So when you look at costs have kind of gone up by 30% from 2018 to 2024. That we're talking phase 3 trials here. That is a significant jump. If you're bringing in efficiencies, costs should have gone down. Okay, costs went up. Have we become more efficient? The percentage of trials having delayed startups has increased. You're looking at 5% in 2003, jumping up from 5% to 22% last year. That's a huge jump. Why is that happening? A lot of questions that are coming up. Protocol amendments, those have also jumped up from 57% to 76%. So, and while Tufts is presenting this data, I think it also called out an important point. At least a fourth of those amendments were avoidable, and these amendments are expensive. You're talking about anything from about 150 to over 500K as the cost for each amendment. So do we really need to kind of walk this way? Are there ways of doing things better? Can we use data to provide more insights and navigate our pathway better? Look at the amount of data that's being collected. Close to 6 million data points have been collected for a phase 3 study. Great. So are we able to really leverage it effectively? A third of the data is not even contributing to primary and secondary endpoints. So at an overarching level, I think you're seeing that the complexity is scaling and you're having more vendors, more handoffs, more tech, and it's becoming a multi-dimensional play over here for clinical trials. But how do we really deal with this? What do you think, Ian? Who are the critical decision makers who are really kind of playing an important role in clinical trial design today? And where are the friction points that are coming up?
Yeah, those are all great points. I mean, a lot of it kind of goes back to the symptom of we've got really cool, innovative therapies that are coming, that are being studied. And I think a lot of the complexity ends up being drawn from that. But I think just to some of the points you had made, there's still opportunities to keep a trial simplified in the context of, how can we think about eligibility criteria? How can we think about our schedule of assessments and the activities therein to make it easier on the patient, easier on the site. And also, I think you had mentioned this too, the with so much at stake, with so many of these trials coming, these pivotal trials that are pretty mission critical for a lot of sponsors, for CROs as well, the cost of being wrong really has never been higher. It's gone up, tremendously. And so I think it's interesting that, but my 2 cents of a lot of it is none of it's really irrational behavior that I've seen in terms of like what's changed and kind of what's come up. It's pretty natural, like a rational response to some of the higher stakes. But I think without some of the right data, without some of the right processes in place, it often leads to some of the fragile designs and some of the challenges that lead to amendments down the road. You mentioned, thinking a bit about some of the challenges that do come up. We do have an AI council that we launched actually last year in June timeframe. Sid Jane from Recursion is a participant in that. And some of the challenges that you had mentioned, he lives in, on a day-to-day, if not a year-to-year basis, right? You often realize midway through the study that some of the criteria you put in, some of the visits you put in were too burdensome, causing the trial not to be able to recruit or ultimately achieve its endpoint, right? And that's challenging because you've got so many parties involved, so many different stakeholders that we need to work with both internally as well as you mentioned, vendors externally to make sure that we get it right and that execution down the road ends up working out. So definitely, very interesting points there. And I think you alluded to something here just in terms of kind of where we're going next of, who's involved in designing the clinical trial today and whom else is really participating in it. And I think the interesting point here is we probably won't be able to list everybody that's involved, right? Thinking a bit about, maybe the sponsor perspective of who's involved internally and not necessarily the external portion here for just a second. But larger sponsors, often it's a committee-driven process, as you know. You're starting with clinical development. You've got an endpoint or scientific intent in mind, and then now you need to design a trial around that. And where do you start? How do you look? What sorts of data are you leveraging to be able to start from a trial design standpoint? And is that internal information that we've got that we're leveraging for decision making? Is that public data, say from clinicaltrials.gov, for example, or other registries where we've seen past execution from trials that maybe happened 5, 10, 15 years ago, right? But with the modern trial, it becomes more challenging. So this committee process where clinical development, clinical operations, you've got statistics, regulatory, safety, medical affairs, medical writing, all kind of having a hand in the pot here in terms of developing a protocol. The rigors there, I think that's the upside that I've seen. You get a lot of perspective and really a lot of rounded out thoughts, but I think that the downside is it's a lot of aggregation of information versus a focus on optimization throughout, which I think that can lead to some challenges and some frictions down the road. And with clinical development really having their scientific intent kind of really already set, now we've got endpoints, objectives, eligibility criteria, right, already defined early in the process. It becomes challenging because we want to maximize the signal. We want to maximize and make sure we've got regulatory defensibility too when we do end up going and submitting externally. But sometimes some of those operational constraints get lost a bit in the mix. I think on the large sponsor side, there's a lot of data out there that can help inform things down the road in terms of what prevalence data is there, where are the patients being treated, what do HCPs think about this, for example. But we think about smaller sponsors, say smaller biotechs and life sciences organizations. A lot of that expertise really is just relying on, what the institutional knowledge is, right? So it becomes challenging for them to execute too. And I think that's often where I see some of the friction showing up for some of these parties that are involved in the drafting and the design process and ultimately the execution process, is that there's a lot of trade-offs, and they're implicit, but they're not necessarily explicit really in that context. And sometimes the trade-offs really aren't necessarily data-driven, as folks aren't all pulling from the same corpus of information. They've got data silos and different parts of the process that they're following. And so you've got input here that kind of contradicts and counteracts the input that's downstream, say from operations, for example, as well. And any changes that need to be made, that's a slow process. It's a painful process too, especially if the protocol's already been submitted and it's been activated, for example, as well. And then really the challenge ends up becoming is where does the patient and the site voice fit into all of this, right? Because at the end of the day, if we have a hard time finding the right sites that can execute on the trial and then ultimately finding the right patients that can not only be identified potentially for the trial as a potential candidate, but also be randomized and then also be retained, in a trial too, depending upon how we've designed it. It becomes challenging, right? For downstream execution, you may not ever meet your endpoint because, well, maybe you do meet your endpoint, but it takes 6, 9, 12 more months on top of that, which the costs there are pretty significant from that side. So often what we're sort of seeing from a friction standpoint, at least from our end, is not so much a lack of expertise or kind of a battling really in that regard. It's really everybody's kind of optimizing for their own function and locally based off of what they're focused on. And without that kind of shared operational view and that shared worldview from a data perspective of what actually happens in the real world, I think that you kind of can create some challenges down the road for execution. But any thoughts there just from your end and your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you brought up some brilliant points out there, Ian. I mean, I have worked in the clinical trial industry for about 30 years in my past life. And the points that you're making about, hey, everyone, while you try to integrate the process, everyone is looking at this with their own lens. So whether you're looking at it from clinical operations, RBM, medical writing, as a statistic, as a medical statistician, as a medical monitor, everyone has their own angle. And also the point that you made is once it's kind of out of the gate, you've already submitted it to the regulators, then making any changes becomes, very complex. So how do you really bring this all together and streamline processes, streamline the whole protocol development setup? I would agree with you that is kind of, that is an upfront challenge that has been and will probably continue to be there for a long time, though. Though I would say that, I feel that things like AI, technologies like AI are going to play a crucial role, because at the end of the day, we're all simple, humble human beings who can assimilate and integrate only so much of data and see things from a certain perspective. But if you can get the intelligence garnered from multiple sites, multiple studies, and get a wider, broader perspective, which is then laid out for everyone, I think it really makes things, puts things there in black and white, and helps really optimize things, and also helps optimize things in real time.
Perfect. That sounds great. And you mentioned intelligence. I think the foundation of intelligence often is data. So when we think a bit about what types of data sources organizations and individuals are pulling into the different trial design components, from your lens here, where do teams typically obtain the data needed to inform trial decisions?
Sure. So, I mean, I think really data is everything. I really feel sometimes that the life sciences industry is increasingly becoming a data sciences industry with all the innovation powered by data, like it or not, right? So it's data is the backbone of the trial. It's shaping the questions. It is crystallizing the protocol, and it is really scaling innovation. So data sources, you alluded to some of them in when you're speaking earlier. You have public data sources, you have trial registries, you have things like the International Clinical Trial Registry Platform, you have clinicaltrials.gov. Then companies are looking inwards to their internal program data, whether it is earlier protocols, what were the types of amendments that they dealt with, what were the clinical study reports, published evidence, systematic review, systematic literature. Then you have, peer-reviewed papers, meta-analysis that's done out there, real-world data. I mean, there were, oh my gosh, how many FDA guidances that were issued supporting the use of real-world evidence. At the end of the day, I think you're seeing an increasing focus on, hey, move beyond RCTs to look into what's really happening out there. So claims data, EHRs, data, and then commercial intelligence, really looking at site feasibility data or patient recruitment, patient eligibility data. And then finally, one cannot afford to ignore, of course, the regulatory guidances, which are continuously coming up, which are going to really play a critical role in guiding strategy. So if you look at some of, the areas where data is coming in, so for example, if you're looking at indication sizing, you want to look at things like prevalence data. what's the prevalence of the disease, what are the care pathways, what are the geos where, for example, disease registries would play a critical role, real world data would come in. You're looking at eligibility criteria, and also looking at screen failures. You want to look at screen failure logs. For example, I think that could be a useful place for kind of assessing, looking at IRB data to say, hey, which were the areas where you ended up seeing a lot of screen failures? How should you tweak your inclusion exclusion criteria so that you're balancing the need to drive kind of scientific rigor, but at the same time making sure that you are getting the right patients in. Again, and you could look at endpoints, and when you're looking at endpoints, obviously prior clinical trial data is going to be absolutely critical. Also look at adjudication burden when you're looking at things like, it's a complete exercise when you want to kind of do that. Also, you mentioned that earlier, Ian, when we kind of started the discussion. What about patient burden, site burden? Those are going to be critical components in driving the success of the trial. So, so those, and then what about choice around the standard of care? Where do you look for data for standard of care? Again, things like real world data, HTA, health technology assessment reports, the trial registries and overall feasibility assessments, looking at geo data across countries, we're looking at looking at competitive intelligence data, how many other trials is the investigator running, what is his level of therapeutic experience, what were the number of protocol deviations that came up. So I think these are some examples that I could share where I think these are very valuable data sources to guide trial decisions.
Yeah,
so,
that's great.
Yeah.
And a lot of it, I mean, it's interesting too. Like I often kind of bucket a lot of this into what's data that we have internally as an organization from our own kind of knowledge that we've got, whether we're a brand new biotech and we've amassed the smartest minds in the room in a very specific rare indication. And then, okay, what's the public data that's out there, right? This, CT.gov being a wealth of resourcing, but often a lagging indicator. I say lagging, I throw that in quotes because there's regulatory guidance and requirements on when you need to update your information there, but it's still not real time, right? I think that's the challenging part for a lot of folks too, but still a wealth of information. Same with other regulatory bodies as well, where you can pull information from too. And then there's that private, data sector where you talk about RWD, RWE, EMR, EHR, really to help inform, what's happening with the patient, really boots on the ground. But some of that data too is again lagging, right? In terms of how can you then make the connectivity, depending upon where your therapy is at. And if you're going for third line, fourth line, right? Like patients are in desperate need of care and desperate need of therapy. And if the lagging indicator ultimately is too late, right? It's challenging to then meet the patient where they are. And then is the protocol we're putting in front of them too burdensome for them given where they are at in their health journey? So all of that, I think those are all wonderful points to me too. And I think those are all data elements that I think have been available for a good amount of time and have been operationalized. And depending upon the organization that we come across, some have access and the means and the scale to be able to consume a lot of that, but then others don't necessarily have that access to. So they're often relying on really kind of that first part, which is, hey, we know what we know internally, and I think that's about what we can either afford or what else can we pull in on a very kind of simplistic manner. But it requires a lot of human interaction to be able to synthesize that data and a lot of time too that we're seeing as well. So I think what I'm sort of seeing is most teams have access to a lot of this information, but as you kind of mentioned, especially on the IRB and the operational data front, really what we found is some of the hardest to access piece of information really has been this operational data and the real world execution of a trial and what's been happening really longitudinally and how these studies really behave in the real world once they start to get patients in, once they do go to the sites, for example. And that's something that I think that IRB data in particular and the operational insights that can be generated from it really can help bridge the gap and help, I think, unlock a novel data source that folks haven't been able to access before in the past. All right, let's go to the next question here, and I'll take this one. So which data source is hardest to access or validate today? And I think you'll definitely get some opinions here for sure. I'm sure the audience has lots of perspective of where they think something is more challenging depending upon where they live and they sit. For example, either both geographically or what kind of organization they're a part of. But often what we're finding as a central IRB and the conversations that we've been having with customers over the past couple of years is really the data that's been stuck sitting in a protocol document, the static form that's sitting in either an unstructured or partially structured system really is largely inaccessible, or if it is accessible, it's challenging to scale insights from a specific protocol across not only its own protocol of what changes have been happening and what are the ramifications and the impact of those changes that we're making in not only the real world, but internally here from an operation standpoint, but then also how do we then apply those changes maybe to our broader portfolio, or maybe how do we apply those changes more broadly to our therapeutic area or to other therapeutic areas that we support too. So often what we're kind of finding from a hard to access is that the operational data embedded in the protocols and the amendments themselves are really extremely challenging to access because really, and we'll get to this here in the near future, AI hadn't been around just yet to be able to unlock and be able to glean insights for the vast majority of organizations and sponsors as well. And I think the interesting part is that the IRB operational data is really uniquely rich from our lens, and it shows how these protocols and the trials really change just about in real time, but how they've changed longitudinally over the life cycle of the trial. So if there are changes to exclusion criteria, inclusion criteria, for example, right out of the gate, even before a patient hits the trial, for example, or if there's downstream modifications because as they see patients randomizing into their trials, we're starting to see dropout potentially based off of maybe visit number 5 because there's 6 hours worth of assessments that are happening, for example, too. And some demographic categories that becomes untenable for patients to be able to participate and be able to stay within the trial for longer. So the challenge really isn't from our lens, like the data's there. I think the unlocking of it really and the usability of it has been the challenge that we've sort of noticed and something that we've been looking to kind of address on our side internally. And I think what's interesting about AI lately, as we kind of transition and pivot a bit of our conversation here, is AI has really been able to unlock a lot of things for a variety of use cases, probably dozens, if not thousands, to tens of thousands of use cases across healthcare. And when we think a bit about IRB operational data and protocol data in particular, it's able to transform these documents, these static kind of unstructured documents, often scanned documents too, into analyzable insights and signals that sponsors, CROs, others can use externally as they begin to think about their trial designs, either for their current trials or for future trials that they're considering as well. So one of the things that we've been working on a lot internally as well is thinking a bit about, there's a number of best-in-class extraction models for being able to take out all the different bits and pieces of a protocol because these documents are quite extensive, and being able to do that accurately so that not only can you then extract the information, but then that creates actually a benchmarking data set to be able to compare your protocols or other protocols against that data in the future, which has been super exciting. So that enables us to not only be able to move quickly on not only the extraction front for net new protocols, but also be able to highlight visit burden, amendment drivers, et cetera, as well, because we can be able to take those components out and do logical comparisons as well. So I mentioned it a bit already today, but just externally here for the audience at home, last August, we launched our study design capabilities at Advarra. And as part of that, the underpinning of that solution set is what's called Braid, and that's our data and AI engine. What we've done is it's foundationally built intelligence and insights on top of de-identified protocol information. So taking tens of thousands of protocols that we've seen, of course, de-identifying those, then being able to create a brand new data set and data layer that enables folks to be able to generate insights and benchmarking of their own protocols against how protocols have been run in the past, which has been super exciting. And this is where I think AI in particular becomes most valuable when we think about operationalizing this data, just because of the complexity and the nuance of it. We find that it's been challenging to unlock the information, but we're on the forefront. We're in the very beginning of it, which has been super exciting. But we've gotten lots of great feedback so far from the work we've been doing with Braid, and then all the possibilities, the potential to come with some of the capabilities that we have coming down the road. So to move forward into our AI section of our webinar here, let's talk a bit about the role of AI in study design and protocol development. Namita, how are you seeing from your experience and the conversations you're having AI being used in study design and protocol development today?
Oh my gosh, I think there isn't a conversation that I'm having which is not covering this topic. And actually, there is, I think, there's such a laser focus on this space right now. I think a point that you kind of effectively brought up was the need to be nimble, to be able to leverage data real time and to garner intelligence real time, because it's not very helpful after, the protocol has been approved, after patients have had, have fallen off the trial, or site is no longer recruiting as expected, that you start thinking about, hey, what are my next steps? Increasingly, if you see the protocol designs, they're requiring agility. They're requiring you to make decisions on the fly. And it's only AI that's really going to play a role in enabling that. So many, many different areas where you're seeing applications of AI. I think the first thing is actually pressure testing protocols. And there are various examples of companies that have actually done that, leveraging real world data to improve things like eligibility criteria, to eliminate treatment arms, which they believe are not going to succeed, where they've actually ended up shortening study timelines significantly, and as well as saved a couple of $1 million just in that process. So also the ability kind of to balance what is, balance your scientific intent with what is really feasible. And AI can play a critical role in enabling that by carrying out scenario planning. Say the what if piece, which is difficult for a single human being to predict across multiple trials, multiple protocols, and multiple sites. I mean, you saw that happening when risk-based monitoring evolved as a practice, or RBQM, as you may, and now you're seeing that coming up. And the big enabler is obviously AI. Also, Ian, we spoke about things like patient and site burden. So you made a mention about, hey, you have so many assessments. Can you do away with a few which are not essential? And can you leverage AI to kind of ensure that the ones that you're skipping are while you're skipping them, you're still ensuring compliance and improving, the patient experience as well? Can you actually improve the probability of success of your clinical trials and the likelihood of approval? Also use of AI to develop things like synthetic control arms or external control arms, which are also playing an important role in accelerating, rare disease studies, and of course, reduce time, reduce risk to patients in areas where the therapy is pretty complicated. Then looking at things like Gen AI-enabled protocol authoring, which is now such a hot space. I'm actually going to be authoring a report on that sometime soon. But actually building out the first draft, you see various companies playing in this area, whether you talk of Novo Nordisk and so many others, Merck, into automation of CSR authoring and others. It's there is data out there which is showing that it is really upping their game and helping them accelerate the process. And of course, AI agents to orchestrate workflows. Can you have a lot of the data shifts from the protocol to study build? Actually, study build automation is another piece directly from the protocol structure to actually accelerate the entire automation of study build. And can AI agents play a role in moving the data across the process? The redundancy, I have written clinical study reports and protocols and done IND and NDAs, and sometimes you feel like putting your head down and crying with grief at the amount of redundancy that exists everywhere. And not only is it a tedious process, it's also a lot of high risk of error as you move through these. Can AI agents orchestrate that? And finally, can you really look at, the intelligence that you're garnering through the kind of, the operational data, which will really help you streamline and optimize your clinical trial design? So is it going to really make a difference in terms of hard dollars that are saved? I think yes. Can you really fine-tune clinical interpretations? I think so. So I think there's huge promise out there.
That's wonderful. And I loved all the examples and different use cases that you were outlining too. I mean, that's what we're hearing as well, which is super exciting of the possibilities of it. And I think the sort of what I'm kind of hearing is there's plenty of different ways to be able to leverage AI to shorten kind of the internal window of having to draft and develop a protocol, whether that's using generative AI to do querying and creation of protocol, to leveraging agents, to then moving the different components around, getting it to different teams, being able to provide input more quickly, or being able to synthesize data, in an aggregated kind of maybe accessing underlying sensitive information in an aggregated anonymous way, to be able to then promote different insights and perspectives really in real time as the design is happening and as we're kind of contemplating it too. And I think that's been what's been super interesting from our lens is, what sort of data can power a lot of the different components of AI, and what is AI referencing internally as its gospel for what looks good? What does good look like? What makes sense? And what's accurate? What's correct? What does success look like at the end of the day? Which really is going to obviously vary from compound to compound, indication to indication. But it's been super interesting. But also, as you mentioned too, catching some of the risks when you're doing scenario planning as well, and taking a look at the potentiality and the possibilities to come with the current design. So I think the gist that I'm sort of seeing is like there's AIs, of course, it's here. It's starting to become the standard, especially for a lot of larger sponsors too, of you need to be using this, whether it be from drafting to synthesis to execution. And it's really evolving more from just simply a tool you're using to query information, and really as a set of collaborators, really, using different agents or different AI tools as really a companion or a voice on your shoulder here, if you will, to be able to help you kind of continuously evaluate and stress test what some of those design decisions will ultimately be. But I think that does sort of beg the question, with all this AI floating around and all these cool tools and all the amazing things you can do with it, where does the human expertise really remain essential? Where does the human in the loop remain? And what are some of the things that we do extremely well that AI is still struggling with?
Yeah, I mean, that's such an important piece. Everyone's totally gung-ho about AI, and not to say that I'm not. I think the promise that it brings to the table is phenomenal. But yeah, there are certain things that we do need to keep in mind. I think one of the first things is like, as it's an accepted fact, AI is as good as the training data that is being used to train it. So is it able to kind of make those nuanced decisions that a healthcare provider may make who has 30 years of experience, and where would that play a critical role? For example, contextual reasoning, I think, is going to be a very, very important piece. Like, can you bring all those pieces together, look at what's existing medical practice, what's the standard of care, and how should those decisions be made? Also looking at something that's kind of out of the blue, which may not fall into the training data set, maybe socioeconomic conditions of the patient, maybe some rare comorbidities that the patient may have. How are you addressing those? Also, another part that I would say is, for example, looking at, Ian, you spoke about it, the voice of the patient. You're designing something which hypothetically is perfect, but are you weaving in empathy into that assessment? Are you assessing patient burden? Are you focusing on patient centricity? Then, of course, things like bias. Is there an element of bias that's coming in based on the training data set? Do you need to look at that? How are you carefully addressing that? Are you, AI can actually play a role in fueling diversity by design, but you also need to track back and ensure it's not biasing the data. And then looking at things like explainability, regulatory compliance. I think being up to speed with the evolving regulations of AI globally while you're implementing these strategies, I think is so critical. And finally, things like GXP compliance. So you want to leverage AI, you want to forge ahead, but I think you need to ensure that it is appropriately validated. You're using responsible AI, and also really building trust within the patient and the provider community. What are your views on this, Ian?
It's the responsibility part, I think that, and building trust really at the end of the day, right? Like we've seen, I mean, even rewind the clock, a few years back when the sponsor community was keenly focused, and rightfully so, but maybe, a bit late, in my opinion, looking at, diversity and inclusion when we think about trials and the types of populations that we're designing medicines for, right? I mean, the cat out of the bag there was that AI was often creating a protocol or designing a trial or supporting and creating data analytics and doing RWD analysis that reinforced, decisions that were not representative of the patient population that really ultimately was going to be needing the medicine, right? And so I think that that's something that if we can help a patient, a site, even others within our organization trust the outputs, so it's not really, as many will say, kind of a garbage in, garbage out sort of an output, right? Like you need to have strong foundational data that is being used to help inform some of these outputs. But at the end of the day, the human expertise remains critical. It remains essential. And oftentimes, you don't want AI going and designing something often a little black box, because at the end of the day, it's going to just do what it knows or whatever the kind of the initial intent was, right? So we need to define intent as humans. Like we need to start it down a path that we want. There's a lot of sense checking along the way to help us with this optimization journey or with the development journey too. But ultimately, we are the ones that are helping decide what questions the study should be answering, what endpoint at the end of the day we think makes the most sense from the evidence that we see, and of course maybe leveraging AI too to uncover something that we aren't seeing through maybe that signal and the noise as well. And then also, what are the trade-offs, right? I think human beings are much better at making decisions on trade-offs and some of the risk that's worth taking externally too with what we're developing as well. So AI could help inform a lot of those decisions. I don't think it doesn't make sense for it to own them, right? I think it's as much a partner in the room with you to help provide a perspective. And then at the end of the day, we are the ones that make the decision downstream, right? So in those ambiguous or maybe unprecedented situations that we run into where AI hasn't crossed that boundary and hasn't seen that outcome or seen that output before, it doesn't know. Like it's looking at, old information potentially. So that's where I think we come in to help really be able to draw from, our sense of accountability, our sense of experience, the values that we have as human beings, and not just simply looking at, relationships and patterns and other times. So, okay, so let's move forward a bit here. And Namita, maybe another question for you here. When we look a bit at, how do you think AI is transforming study design workflows and some of the decision making that's happening today?
I think it is playing a critical role. I think, we spoke about protocol design optimization and building protocols. The way I authored a clinical trial protocol 25 years or 30 years ago, and the way it's being done today has completely changed, right? I mean, they've become living, dynamic digital documents, right? It's machine readable. It's dynamic, as I said. So you're seeing a shift from static documents to dynamic documents, which is important also if you want to kind of scale efficiencies, but also if you want to make relevant changes as well. And then, of course, the ability to, like I said, translate that protocol directly into automating study database build. is another, I think, important thing. I believe the industry has kind of moved out of the pilotitis stage into actually looking at saying, how do we scale this enterprise-wide? And also, rather than having individual tools, how do you embed this into workflows? So instead of, adopting new solutions in my existing workflows without disrupting my existing workflows, how can AI become an integral part of my life? I think that's where you're really seeing the value. So CSRs, protocols, ICFs are really being designed, maybe 50% faster or even more, depending on, different organizations are reporting different degrees of efficiencies, but you are seeing the huge efficiency gain there. Again, another area we touched upon scenario planning, like assessing the impact of eligibility criteria, reducing participant burden, also optimizing investments, site optimization, looking at picking up the right sites. How do you drive adaptive trial design and look at like mid-course adjustments along the way? The shift that you're seeing, and you kind of referenced this earlier, saying in old times it was really about analytics. I think that shift has moved, the needle has moved from analytics to predictive to actually becoming a recommendation engine, saying this is what you should do. And that is really the value that is coming in, today. Also, for example, if there is like a protocol deviation that's happening, many times in the past, you were like, okay, you look at all the data and you say, hey, there was a protocol deviation, and you log it on the protocol deviation log. But hey, the damage is already done. Can you have a predictive approach, saying there is a likelihood of something going wrong? How do you preempt this in the first place, rather than just log it into that log? And how do you actually improve clinical outcomes and patient safety through those approaches? All right. I think these are like some examples that I could share. But did you want to add to that, Ian?
Yeah, I think those are great. And just to hone in on one point you made as a recommendation engine, I think that's really what a lot of we're seeing AI used by ourselves and others really as well, as it's shifting study design in particular, from being kind of a reactive, hey, something happened, now we got to go back, amend, rinse, repeat. Now the data's there. It can be operationalized. It can then be consumed by AI. And then now you can create that recommendation, or that anticipation engine, really, if you will, to give you a bit of that kaleidoscope into what's to come, so that as you are making design decisions and understanding, what maybe is going to happen with feasibility, what's going to happen with burden on the side of the patient, what's going to happen after activation as well, you can actually start to model and stress test that a lot, which I think is super interesting. And it really turns, I think, a lot of the activities, especially the decision-making in particular, is more of a continuous, and it enables that cross-functional decision-making too, because it enables everybody, if they're operating again from that same data set, using the same tooling and the same capabilities, it allows them to evaluate the design really in real time from their perspective, all in a single spot, if you will, to be able to have that dynamic input happening, so that everybody can kind of see what the design decisions are happening overall. So I think that shift from reacting to problems and to anticipating them is kind of exactly what we've been seeing and hearing from our customers as well, of what's been most valuable from an AI standpoint. And in particular, one of the other members of our responsible use of AI council as well, Michelle Ryder from Sanofi, really is thinking about this a lot too, in terms of some of the challenges that she's seeing, but also how can you leverage AI. And really, in her words, if we're smarter about the way we're designing, we can simulate and model what could happen before we activate the trial. And I think we can knock out 2/3 of the amendments that we make today. And when we go back to some of the costs you mentioned, especially from Tufts and that report, drafted, I believe, back in 2015, with, of course, revisions and updates to then, but say extrapolate that to 2026 with inflation, increasing vendor costs, all the other things that are happening with trials. I mean, we're seeing on our side, from an overall cost perspective, really a phase 2 trial with a significant amendment, that could be upwards of $500,000 now, depending upon kind of the scope. And then when you think about a global phase 3 with, say, hundreds of sites, for example, that's, you're looking in the 7 figures there easily in terms of all the implementation of changes, updated training, et cetera, that you're making as well. So there's a lot of implications downstream that we're seeing from, hey, how can you use AI up front to help de-risk and reduce some of those challenges downstream from an execution standpoint, but then also, can we catch some of these amendments and some of these symptoms of amendments before they actually happen and before I need to actually issue an amendment as well? And we've got some examples as well, just from some of the work that we've done in the past of how can you use operational data and some of these insights from a study design standpoint to really improve some of the design decisions externally too. And if it's okay with you, I'll share a bit of just a story that we have from a sponsor and a customer that we worked with here for those that are attending the call. But just to give a bit of perspective here, the sponsor had a hypothesis around the types and number of amendments that they were typically seeing in comparison to their peers. And they thought that they were having more amendments than they felt they should be having, as well as if there was potential for them to reduce some of the amendments that they were seeing, in particular across their oncology portfolio. And so one of the things that we did was we took a look at an older study to see, hey, was there an area of opportunity for Advarra to catch based off of the operational data that we've been able to create, that intelligence layer built from Braid using our study design capabilities? Can we catch some of these amendments before they would be amendments? Can we catch some of these flaws and potential risk areas ahead of time? And the answer was yes. We benchmarked their study, compared it to other studies across, in this case, non-small cell lung cancer. We looked at a variety of different cohorts that not only matched what exactly their trial looked like, but also looked, from a basket perspective, what other similar trials as well looked like compared to theirs. And the gist of it is they had an extremely complex trial. They had a lot of biomarkers that they were looking to exclude from their trial as well, which creates some complexity around their eligibility criteria and inclusion, exclusion, as well as some of the assessments that they were ultimately looking to perform too. And that is a direct correlation to amendment drivers, right? The higher the complexity, just across the board, there is going to be downstream amendments down the road, or at least a higher likelihood and a propensity depending upon the therapeutic area and the indication. So we did 2 things. We did the benchmarking, and we're able to compare that against our trial operations data set. And we found that there was a signal there in terms of some of the modifications that we would recommend from a risk area, of areas they may run into from a patient and from a site burden, from a recruitment standpoint as well. And then we took a look at a future protocol they had from an amendment standpoint to see, hey, what actually happened in the real world? And sure enough, we caught a lot of the things that ended up happening in the real world. Of course, something to note, a lot of the amendments that do happen, I think, Namita, you mentioned this at the very, very beginning, Tufts, I think, depending upon who you ask and therapeutic area indication, but there's that varying range of 25 to maybe 40% of amendments can be termed as, say, avoidable or potentially avoidable, right? And there's also a lot of amendments that come through that aren't, right? You get data coming back, you got to adjust how you're approaching the trial. Maybe the PK results are coming back, you got to make some modifications, update the sites as well and the patients too. So there are some areas that we caught that were, of course, unavoidable that really downstream, that was something that regulatory bodies would capture as well. But the interesting part is that we did capture some of the avoidable amendments there too, which was super interesting because that actually creates material downstream benefits, because they can help create some cost avoidance and some risk avoidance, really, from not only the trial having challenges executing downstream, but then also running into costs too of having to ultimately amend the trial, which was super interesting. So it was a really unique and really awesome opportunity for us to kind of flex what some of the capabilities are within our study design offering there. But more to come as well. But it was super exciting. Before we kind of get into questions here, and we'll kind of wrap up here just with just a bit of detail here. I've alluded to it in particular, but if folks haven't seen some of the releases, Advarra launched a new study design offering to help organizations optimize their protocols And we have a number of different ways to be able to consume the insights and the capabilities that we have to really be able to glean some of those operational insights back for your protocol. One is a concierge service where we consultatively work with you to benchmark your protocol against other like protocols and the insights that we've derived from them to be able to help you understand, what are some potential execution challenges that may come down the road, and where areas potentially that we may see amendments and opportunities to modify different areas to help reduce amendment likelihood, for example. The workspace is a data science way of being able to access the underlying insights and data layer that we've been able to generate as well. So accessing some of those operational insights that Braid's been able to create, and really to be able to do that in scale and integrate that within kind of your internal data infrastructure and ecosystem as well. And then we just launched the app here. We'll see some more information on here if folks are going to scope, for example. We'll talk a bit about it there. But that's a new web-based app really designed for anybody that's involved in the protocol design process. So being able to very simply and easily look at benchmarks for other protocols, compare your protocol against the protocols and the data that we have within our data set too, to be able to help glean insights and be able to provide some of those anticipatory and some of those information that could be relevant, for you as you think about, how to potentially design your trial that's currently in motion or your trial in the future. So more to come there. But if you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to Advarra, and we're more than happy to answer those and find some time to chat. But maybe with maybe a couple minutes here, and we'll jump into questions here. But Namita, any closing thoughts on the topics that we covered? Anywhere you feel like we wanted to kind of maybe double dip a little bit more into?
I'll just say that I think you wrapped it up beautifully. And I also like the way you kind of referenced the kaleidoscope. I remember as a kid, I was always fascinated how all the pieces came together to make a beautiful design. And actually, your solution could bring all the players together to actually design the protocol. Makes a very interesting analogy. So yeah, I think there's a lot of excitement that the future has to offer as we start digging into these solutions.
Perfect.
All right. Well, thanks, guys. I'm going to come back in here just for a couple audience questions. We've got just a few minutes. And so Ian and Namita, this was awesome. So thanks so much for this. I love the discussion, some great insights. And we do have a lot of questions, and for sure we won't get to them all. So audience members, I'll pass those along again to Ian and Namita for some potential follow-up after the event. But let's get to maybe one or two here if we can. So are teams mostly reusing data they already have, or are they constantly pulling it from new sources?
Namita, thoughts? And I can add some color.
Sure. So very quickly, I think it's kind of a hybrid approach. They're definitely trying to tap into internal data sources, past protocols, CSRs, data sets, screening logs, protocol deviation logs, as you may, just to name a few. But there is a very sharp lens, an outward lens as well, looking for example, operational data, whether it's IRB data, whether it's, data sources are exploding. I mean, you're also looking at things like the huge tech play that's come in, wearables and others where sensor data is flowing in, site data, competitive intelligence data, multiple data sources. So I think real world evidence data, obviously. So it's a huge interplay. And would you like to add some color to that?
Yeah, I think it depends. Looking at the sponsors, depending on the size of the sponsor, there is a lot of reusing of internal information, which if you've got a lot of experience and expertise in a certain therapeutic area or indication, I think that's where, knowing what you know already can really help inform strong trial design, because you know what's worked. You know specifically how to execute in a very specific indication, very specific phase. You know what sites to go for example. You know exactly how to get to patients too, and get them the care that they need. But also, I think it does kind of bring up the point of, like, if you're going into a brand new therapeutic area or an area that you're not as familiar with, where are you getting the information from? And so I think that there's going to be that balance of, yes, you use internal information and some internal expertise, but there's always value to having your internal expertise, no matter how vast it is, being sense checked by an independent third party, if you will. So I think that there's a unique opportunity there for folks that, if you think you've got the best stuff, I think there's always an opportunity to improve and use additional data sources to help validate that your thinking is correct.
Yeah, I would just quickly add to that. I think organizations also struggle, especially the big ones, where they have loads and loads of data, but sometimes bringing it all together, especially when they're dealing with M&As and so on and so forth, or even large global companies, how do you bring that all together to gather those insights? That also remains a fundamental challenge. But over to you.
Okay, yeah, perfect. Let's try to get one more question in here real quick. I've got a good one here. So what data sets are part of the AI tools, used for reducing the protocol amendments that you're seeing?
Yeah, and maybe I'll start, and then Namita, I'd love your perspective too. So from our lens, what we're kind of seeing is, as most folks hopefully know, and if you don't, an amendment is a symptom or the end result of some of the symptoms of the challenges you've seen within your trial. So some of the things that can go awry, you think about the components of a protocol, you think, your objectives and your endpoints, those are challenging to change because that's what you're going to go do. But some of the areas that can make life a little bit easier is looking at, IE criteria, looking at your schedule of activities and assessments as well, looking at the context of the protocol. So when you think about what exists within a protocol, all of that can really live within an AI solution and lives within Advarra's walls as well. And also all the longitudinal changes, so all those amendments that are happening and the changes therein, you can see all that as well as the rationale of why those changes are happening too. So I think the nice part about what's available is there's a lot that's available because the protocol holds so much unique, interesting information. And then you can use that to really help inform operationally, how do I want to go design this trial? Not so much the scientific on the intent side of things, but really operationally, what makes the most amount of sense? How have others gone about doing this where they've been successful, for example, as well? Yeah, Namita, go ahead.
I think you're pretty much on point on that. I really feel when you're looking, the point that you made about protocol amendments being really a symptom, a consequence of something having gone wrong when planning was happening. And it's not necessarily something gone wrong when planning was happening, but also because of certain changes. They could be regulatory, they could be site changes and forth. So the ability to tap into kind of really that operational data at that point of time and fuel that intelligence is absolutely critical.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you both. Just real quick, if you guys did have more questions, we're going to have to wrap up here. But if you just click on the little blue mail icons next to the speaker's headshots, it'll open a message for you. That'll stay open after the event closes. So you can just reach out to them directly as well, or submit it through the Q&A box right now. And again, I'm going to pass those along to the team for sure. There's also a resource at the bottom right corner of the screen. You should see, I think it's Avara Study Design Service. You can click on that, download that resource right now. It'll give you the PDF and direct access to it. But with that, again, Ian and Namita, thanks so much for joining us today. This was an amazing discussion, a lot of great stuff, great insights, and it's awesome to see what you're doing. And to the audience, thank you so much as well. We appreciate you being here today. And, thanks for sticking around. We hope you all have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.